So welcome to the London Business School. It's a real honor and pleasure to see all of you here. Now, my name is Elias Papaioannou, and I'm academic co-director of the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development, which was established 7 years ago with a very generous gift to the school by Tony and Maureen Wheeler, who many of you may have not met, but you have all seen and got pleasure out of their important venture, The Lonely Planet. So we're very proud as a school that Tony is an alumni of the school, and thanks to his generosity, the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development has been trying to do three things in the past 7 years. First, sponsor and conduct rigorous research across the areas that the London Business School covers. Second, promote innovative open access teaching that complements the fantastic teaching that we do at the London Business School. And third, force communities of practice and organize events featuring bold ideas that we would like our students to take forward in their business ventures. We have held a couple of events, book launches. To mention a few, we hosted our forthcoming dean, Sergei Guriev, last year, Daron Adzemoglu, a dear friend and co-author of Andrew Scott. But this is a fantastic event for us because we are welcoming Andrew Scott, our dear colleague at the London Business School. And for me, who am an alumni of the school, also a former professor and instructor. Andrew has made a fantastic transformation, if I'm allowed to say, in his academic life, starting from doing dynamic macroeconomics, very geeky stuff, very technical. And over time, he has been doing very fascinating work on the economics of longevity. And his new book, The Longevity Imperative, is what we are trying to celebrate today. Patricia Cohen needs a little introduction. She is the global economics correspondent of the New York Times. She has been at the New York Times for many, many years, covering in the past economics, but actually just before I think covering economics, Patty wrote also an interesting book. I think it's called In Our Prime. I tend to believe that I am in my prime, so I urge you to have a close look. So thank you all for being here. It's fantastic for us to see students, alumni, colleagues, students. Let me further acknowledge the presence of Greg Siourounis, who is the chairman of the board of the Sui Foundation. They have contributed very generously to the Wheeler Institute and the research community of the London Business School, being himself an alum of the school and of the PhD program in economics. Thank you all for being here. Andrew, all the best. In Greek, we say kalotaxido. Let the book has a good journey. Thanks a lot for being asked. And let me also thank our dean, François Ortalo-Magné, for joining us today. Please, Andrew.
Evening, everyone. And thank you, Elias, for the introduction. And thank you, too, to the Wheeler for hosting me. Wheeler, they know how to run an event. It's absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much. And thank you all for being here as well. Nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces too. It's a bit strange being here. I'm kind of used to sort of talking at London Business School, but I spent a long time writing a book, and you're kind of on your own writing a book. You're printing the book out, reading it yourself, correcting it yourself. You hand it over to a publisher, and then a year later, I'm standing here in front of a whole bunch of people trying in 25 minutes to explain what the book's about. So let's see how we get on. And I thought before launching into what the book is about, I would begin by telling you a little bit about why I wrote the book, or what I'm trying to achieve with the book. And the first thing I want to try and achieve with the book is to elevate longevity, adapting and adjusting to the longer lives we have, right up there with AI and climate change, as an absolutely key individual and collective priority. We hear a great deal about AI and climate change, how it's important for our future, and how we have to change to adapt to the future, to achieve a good future, all of which is absolutely true, but we don't see much about adapting to longevity and the long lives we've got. And I want to try and persuade you in this book in the next half hour that a fundamental change has occurred to the length of life that means that that is just as important as AI and climate change. The second thing I want to try and do is to try and push to one side the aging society narrative, which is the normal thing we talk about when we talk about longevity. It's about demographic change and there being more old people. and that's always seen as a negative, as a bad thing. And I want to try and say it may not be only a bad thing. There may be some good things about it, but also it's to misplace the emphasis upon what we really want to do. And then the third thing I want to try and do with the book, which is a little bit more, me as an academic or intellectual, which is to try and sort of take this topic, because one reason I find this topic endlessly fascinating is it spreads across so many different disciplines. And of course, in being about longevity, it's about every aspect of life. And I kind of like to think about systems and trying to get patterns and force things together. And there's lots of books written about longevity. Heck, I've even written some of them. But they tend to focus on one aspect. And I want to try and see to what extent we can put it all together in a thematic way so help elevate it up there with AI and climate change. So that's the three things I want to do. And that third one, the sort of the systematizing, is a little bit personal because it's very much my way of thinking. And that's the other thing I really like about this topic. Because, demography is about life and death. And there's nothing more personal than life and death. And actually, I think that's sort of the striking thing about this trend, which is why it's so weird it gets ignored so much, is it's something that's going to transform, it has transformed society, but it's really about each and every one of our lives in a really, really personal way. So let me begin with the talk itself. And let me begin here. I'm going to begin with the aging society story, which is the familiar story, the familiar narrative. And demographers would tell us there's a demographic transition. We're going from a situation where we have a high fertility rate and a high death rate to a low fertility rate and a low death rate. And in that transition, a couple of things happen. The first is this huge increase in the world's population. So these are United Nations charts showing the population from 1950 and their projections out to 2100. And you can see there's this enormous increase in the world population. I'm not so sure of the UN projections out to 2100, but that's a story for another day. Clearly, the world population has increased enormously. The other feature that is always noticed about this chart is if you draw a horizontal line going across, say I'm 58, so let's have 59 as defining being old, or 60 or 65, whatever age you want to actually use, you can see that one of the really big changes that's happened is there's an enormous increase in the number of old people, both in absolute and in proportional terms. So we've got this massive increase in the population, and we've got this big increase in the number of old people. And that aging society story, and the economists in the room will know this, is always seen as a bad news story. I don't know, if I say to an aging society, how do you emotionally feel about that? Do you get excited? Do you go, yeah, great aging society? The very word tends to sort of make us a little bit like, okay. Now, I'd say I think it's an extraordinary story in economics. So basically what we say is there's all these old people. Old people are a problem. They get ill. They don't work. They need a pension. They're a burden. We even have a thing called the old age dependency ratio. And one of the things I want to try and sort of say is that we underestimate the capacity of older people, and we underestimate the capacity of our own later years. And that's absolutely enshrined in this aging society story. And let me just sort of emphasize that fact we underestimate the capacity of older people, because I bet when we come to questions, we are going to repeatedly underestimate the capacity of older people. So I'll just put that out there for the time being. This aging society story is always one about decline. We're kind of a bit messed up on the word aging, and in fact in the book I try and sort of unpick that a little bit, because we go from aging to old, to very old, to end of life, to decline. It's all about decline. And so I think that's a remarkable way of looking at one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. We now mourn the loss of fewer infants. We see fewer parents snatched away in midlife and more grandparents meeting their grandchildren. And economists say, it's a problem. Now, there are problems with it, definitely, and we all know what those problems are. But to see it only as a problem is a real challenge. And I think at this point it's useful to introduce Thomas Malthus. Malthus was a political economist. He taught at Haileybury College. And economics is known as the dismal science. And Malthus is really dismal. Okay? So what Malthus is famous for is his book he wrote in 1798, where he basically says, we've got a problem with population. our ability to support the population can't keep up with population growth. Population grows exponentially, our ability to create resources grows linearly. As a consequence, we will repeatedly find ourselves with starvation, with disease, with war, and that is necessary to keep the population in check, these Malthusian checks. And it's a really dismal story that we can't support this large population. And when Malthus was writing, the world population was just under 1 billion. Last year, it breached 8 billion. Okay? Now, Malthus was smart enough not to give a number and a date to his forecast as to when we would reach a population we couldn't sustain. And clearly there are very real problems around the environment and sustainability. But it's pretty obvious that Malthus's pessimism was broken. So how do we solve that problem of world overpopulation? And how are we going to solve the problem of environmental change? Well, very simply, in a very crude way, we solved Malthus's problem through ingenuity, investment, innovation, and institutions. We effectively had the Industrial Revolution. New ideas, new institutions, new investment, and all those changes meant that every person could be more productive, which supported a larger population. And not only was every person more productive, they were so productive they actually created more resources than they needed, so we can invest in health and education and become ever more productive. So why am I talking about Malthusian problems of overpopulation? Well, the aging society story has got a whiff of Malthus about it. It says our life is getting too long. We can't create the resources to support this life. That's why we've got a pension crisis. This is why we've got a health problem. That we're kind of living too long and there's too many old people. The joy of tackling infant mortality and midlife mortality, of living for longer, is turning to this collective shortage of resources that every country in the world is experiencing. And so if we're going to tackle this aging society story, I think rather than focus on saying there's nothing we can do about it, we have to focus, as we do with AI and climate change, and say, how do we adapt and how do we adjust? Because we can change how we age. And this is not about some secret recipe or supplement I'm going to sell you. There's plenty of people who offer those to you. There's lots of things that we know can make a difference. It's just that for most of human history, we haven't faced the chance of getting old enough to worry about investing in those later years. And so we underinvest in our later years. We underestimate the capacity of later life. And the aging society narrative builds on that and just says we have all these old people. It's about care homes, dementia, and adult diapers. Those are very, very real problems. But that's not the debate I have with my students when I say, hey, what are the big trends that are going to change your future? When I talk about AI and climate change, we have really heated debates about what needs to be done, how we adapt, and how we adjust. And when it comes to demographic change, it's sort of always well down the list of things people tell me about. It's said without any enthusiasm or interest whatsoever. They tell me, I say, what are the big trends that change the world? Eventually they say demographic change. I say, what's that? They say aging society. I say, what's that? They say more old people. That's it. In the summer, I was teaching here at London Business School a bunch of Chinese MBA students in their 30s and 35s. And I was showing them Chinese demographics, which are an extreme version of this aging society. In 40 years' time, the Chinese population will be 400 million people fewer, from 1.4 to 1 billion. And 45% of the population is going to be over 65. So I was saying to these 30-year-old MBA students, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about this aging society China's got? They said, it's terrible. I said, and what do you think about these old people? They said, it's awful. They get ill. They don't work. There's been all that stuff. I said, who are these old people? They looked at me like I was mad. They said, well, they're old people. I said, no, it's you. And there was this sort of remarkable, oh, they really didn't get it. And that's, in essence, the difference between an aging society and a longevity society. An aging society begins when you've got lots of people aged over 65. A longevity society begins when you've got lots of people who will live to be over 65. And that's the thing that's changed. And that's what I want to try and focus on, because if you think about ingenuity, investment, innovation, institutions, we have to adapt to a really fundamental change in human history. There's never been the case before. For the first time ever, the young and middle-aged can expect to become old, and probably very old. There's always been old people. Old people are always young. What has changed is the majority of the young can now expect to become old. Let's look at this chart again. Rather than draw a horizontal line across, draw a vertical line upwards. The thing that's happened is the young can now expect to become the old. Let's give you some probabilities, and the economists in the room will see where I'm coming from in this. In fact, let's not talk about this one for now. When the book came out on Thursday, I was on Radio 4, the Today programme, and I was on with Joan Bakewell, who's a very famous British media intellectual commentator. I think she's 91 in a couple of weeks' time. She's cracked longevity. I mean, she really was deeply impressive. But in going along that morning, I looked at the data. When she was born in 1933, the chances of a newborn girl reaching the age of 91 was 3%. You go to the UK Government Office for National Statistics website, their life expectancy calculator, you type in life expectancy for a newborn today, and basically the children born today have a 50% chance of living into their early to mid-90s. And that's under pretty conservative assumptions about future trends. So we go from 3% chance of making it to 90 to a 50% chance of making it to 90. These are similar to the probability of a 20-year-old making it to 70, 80, and 90, assuming no further progress, assuming what's called period life expectancy, and look at the change. The analogy I always give is the following. I'm going to talk about London and rain. Forgive me if you heard me give this metaphor before, but I'm keen on it. You know, I'm a Londoner. I love London, but it rains a lot. So I look in the morning, and if there's a 10% chance of rain, I don't bother with a raincoat or an umbrella. If there's a 30% chance of rain, I'll pack one of those small umbrellas, won't bother with a raincoat, and I'm kind of prepared. If there's an 80% chance of rain, I've got a big raincoat and a big umbrella. 10, 30, 80%, depending upon probability, I do things differently. That's the probability of a 20-year-old in Sweden making it to 90 in 1851, 1951, and today. And that's it. When you've got this really big probability of becoming old, suddenly things are very, very different. You've got to invest in that future much more. You have to think about the life course differently. And of course, we've structured our life assuming that most people don't make it past 70, 80, or 90. And the problem is all the life expectancy gains are now coming at those age groups. What has sort of happened is a first longevity revolution has come to an end. Due to remarkable past improvements, globally, life expectancy is now 71. That's global life expectancy. Of course, in the rich countries, it's even higher. And so we now need a second longevity revolution to happen, which is we need to change how we age. Because the thing that the aging society story is worried about are real. How do we deal with declining health? How do we deal with declining relevance? How do we make sure we don't outlive our assets, our relationships, and our sense of purpose? But if we can change how we age, if we can invest more in our future, we can age differently. And the aging society story is all about decline. It assumes that aging is fixed and you can't do anything about it. But there are things we can do. It's just we need to not underestimate the capacity of our later years. We need to not underinvest in that. And I'll try and go through what some of those issues were. Aging society begins when everyone's aged over 65. Longevity society begins when you can expect to live beyond 65. It's simply a question of probabilities and where you put your resources. So we have a little syllogism here, a little simple logical argument. I hope, in a way, I've persuaded you through the data, and I can drown you with data if I wanted to, that you can now expect, on average, to become the very old. The majority of children born today will live into their 90s in the UK, for instance. But we fear getting old. That aging society, that negative story taps into something very real. You know, we've all got family members who have dementia or who are struggling in later life. We worry about that. We worry about outliving our health, outliving our skills, outliving our finances, outliving our relationships, outliving our sense of purpose in a world that doesn't really help us maintain them for a long time. So what are you going to do now to ensure you age well? Because in a long life, particularly in terms of health, the key thing now is to age well. And aging is malleable. We can do something about it. We need to remain evergreen. And of course, if we underinvest in our later life years, if we underestimate the capacity of older people, then we get the very outcomes that we fear. We end up outliving our health, our wealth, our sense of purpose, our skills, our relationships, etc. So just as we have to adapt and adjust to AI and climate change, we have to adapt and adjust not to an aging society, but to a longevity society. The really, really interesting change is not there's a lot more old people, that's certainly true, but the really big change is you've got more years ahead of you. At 58, I have to behave differently from my father and my grandfather at 58 because on average I can expect more years than them. I need to age differently. I need to change how we age. So begins this second longevity revolution. Now, this is about so many things, and the book goes far and wide. It's about culture, psychology, politics, Biden versus Trump, gerontocracies, you name it, it's about everything. But I'm going to try in this talk to sort of really just focus on some key things, which is achieving what I call a three-dimensional longevity dividend. We already have these longer lives. It's really important to make them healthier for longer. I can think of few things more important in terms of welfare than making health span now catch up with lifespan. It is critically important. And the other thing we need is we need to be productive for longer. The reason we've got a pension crisis, if we can't produce enough resources over a longer life, we see a fall in our standard of living. If we're not healthy enough over a longer life, we end up spending lots of money on health costs. So we have a hospital system, not a health system, I'll go on to that point later, that keeps us alive for longer. We have cultural norms that assumes that life is over pretty quickly, so there's very little about adult development later in life. And we've got a workforce that starts to leave the labour force at age 50, but still we keep living for longer. We've got to try and adapt and adjust in a very profound way. And as I say, I can think of few things more obviously important for your future than how you age. It is truly quite remarkable how we don't talk more about this. This, by the way, is also key for the macroeconomists in the room, because every country around the world is having an ageing society. They're just at different stages of where they're at. In the UK, the last 10 years, 70% of employment growth is people aged over 50. In the European Union, it's over 100%. There's hardly any productivity growth in Europe and the UK. It's all coming from employment growth. Employment growth is all about older people. If you don't keep people healthier and productive for longer, you won't get GDP growth. In the UK right now, there are nearly 3 million people long-term unemployed who are long-term ill, a large majority of them over 50. That is the nearest thing I can think to a macroeconomic free lunch. How do we get those people working for longer? Now, I'm going to focus on health. There's lots of things. I'm going to do health. I do a little bit about the economy, then I talk about adult development, because there's only a limit. The irony that I always say when I talk about living longer is I always run out of time. But I want to focus on health, and this is some work I'm actually doing with David Bloom at Harvard and Julian Ashwin at Maastricht. And you look at diseases around the world, and you can fit them into 4 categories. We have an algorithm looking at when you get these diseases. So you either get them when you're very young as an infant, early adult diseases, later adult diseases, or the aging-related diseases, the things where the older you get, the risk of getting increases continuously with age. Dementia, cancer, cardiovascular. I'm sorry to be so gloomy, but we've got to look at both sides of this issue. And this is showing you the years lost to life, so the causes of death, and the years lost to ill health. Globally, the biggest health burden already is aging-related diseases. So if you want to think about the #1 challenge for the world's health, it's tackling how we age. And I'll come on to how we can do that later. That's global. This is a slightly different way of looking at it. It's looking at different regions in the world, from low income to high income, and says, let's look at a newborn today. What's their biggest lifetime health burden they're going to face? And even in the low income countries, where life expectancy is now around 62, 63, the biggest lifetime health burden in low income countries is aging-related diseases. This is what I mean by this extraordinary first longevity revolution's come to an end, where the young now have a very high chance of becoming old, and now we need to tackle aging-related diseases. Why are we living longer? Because we've done a really good job of reducing infant mortality. It's still high in low-income countries, but it's falling. We've done a brilliant job of reducing early adult diseases. We're now making progress in later adult diseases, so the biggest health burden now is aging-related diseases. It's about changing our health as we get older. Because this is the situation we're in at the moment. So I want to introduce a little bit to demography here. These are what are called survival curves. These show you the probability of a newborn reaching certain ages. So I've got the United States in 1933 as the blue line, and look at that, terrible high levels of infant mortality in early years. The book actually begins with a personal story. I was born in London in 1965, and I try and illustrate demographic trends by looking at my family, and my family is reassuringly, stunningly average in every regard. So it's a brilliant way of illustrating sort of demographic trends. And to my shock, the most common age of death in the UK in 1965 was less than 1. And that has a sort of resonance. You know, I didn't think I was born in Victorian England. In 1965, the most common age of death was less than 1. And I was an identical twin, and my twin died. So, you know, I thought that was kind of a rare occurrence. The most common age of death, 1965, 0. Today, it's 89 in the UK. Okay? Wow, that's extraordinary. You know, that Sam Beckett quote, we give birth astride the grave, the light flickers an instant, then it's over. Wow, the light's flickering for a lot longer than it used to. Okay, that's kind of what the Longevity Society is about. But you can see that remarkable fall in survival rates because of infant mortality, which has now kind of been ironed out. It's kind of impressive. And there are inequality in the United States that means it's still there. But the probability of someone in the US in 2018 making it through to 54 is sort of around 90%. And the area under these curves is life expectancy. So you can see this great improvement in life expectancy has occurred. But that green line is our health. It's a measure of the burden of disease. And you can see the challenge. As life expectancy increasingly is being driven by improvements from 70 plus, it's coming in years where we're unhealthy. What we've got to do is lower that green line. We want to flatten it as much as possible. Near Barzilai in New York, who's helped me in New York for the launch, says we want to die young at an old age. That's kind of basically what he says. But we're pushing back that survival curve. We haven't tackled the health curve. We've got a health system that's really not a health system, it's a disease system. It keeps us alive, but doesn't keep us healthy. I'll come on to that in a moment. We've got to focus on aging itself. Rather than focus on diseases like smallpox or cholera or typhus, we've got to recognize now that actually the biggest health burden of these aging-related diseases, and it's not a good idea to smoke, it does lead to you have a higher chance of having cancer, but the biggest risk factor for cancer is age. If we could age better in a biological sense, then you reduce the risk of having not just cancer, but cardiovascular disease, dementia, arthritis. You affect multiple diseases, which has a huge gain. And of course, the other thing that's great about that is if you can postpone getting one of these diseases, you actually postpone the distance between the first and the second one. Pushing back on health is really, really important. And that is about focusing not on intervening when you get a disease, but actually staying healthy. It's about preventative health. And of course, we've got a health system that tackles diseases in the first 50 years of life through intervention. Go to hospital, we'll treat you, we'll keep you alive. Brilliant. It's that system that's got us to these life expectancies of 70 or 80. But when you get aging-related diseases, you do not want to go to hospital and be treated with them because you won't be made well. It's going to be extremely costly, and you get multiple morbidities. It's all about preventative health. Why? Because you've got more future, and aging-related diseases are persistent and chronic, and the multi-morbidities around. It's a very different health system that is needed. Big change. I love this picture. It's basically an excuse to try and show a picture of W.H. Auden. Just look at that face. Isn't that fantastic? He's staring at you, just full of character and soul. But he says health is a thing that medicine knows nothing about. Okay? I was talking to a cardiologist the other day and says health is just an incomplete diagnosis. Something's going to go wrong later on. Okay? So we have to focus on health, and that means huge changes in our health system. Prevention, not intervention. So much of our health is determined outside of our health system. It's not determined by the hospitals. It's about the air that we breathe. It's the food that we eat. It's about our public transport, whether we have to walk or not. We've done loads of brilliant innovation in surgeries. We've got to start doing brilliant innovation in prevention. We've got to use the power of AI and big data to monitor health, monitor things you're most likely to get as an individual given your genetic profile, and intervene early to try and stop you becoming ill. We've got to shift from a disease model to a health model. The other thing that has to change is you. And this is going to be a really big challenge because David Cutler from Harvard says that the most underused person in the health system right now is the patient. You know, you don't feel well, you go along to the doctor says this is probably what's wrong with you, take this and I'll test you and I'll give you the dosage. With preventive health, you've got to be monitoring your health a lot more and doing a lot more yourself. So a whole new health system, as well as a focus on aging and geroscience, which is featured in the book. Then there's the economy. And again, huge issues here, because if we're living for longer, we do have to be more productive over our lifetime. And that's either being more productive in the years we work or working for more years. And you kind of can't really overcome that logic. So governments around the world are trying to raise the state pension age. I kind of get that, but it's, to me, not really solving the problem. The problem we've got is we've got to be productive for longer. And raising the state pension age doesn't make you productive for longer. It just means you've got to work for longer. I talked about Samuel Beckett earlier on. Samuel Beckett's brilliant for the Aging Society story. He's kind of got all these wonderful quotes, and I call this the Samuel Beckett theory of retirement, which says, I can't go on, I must go on, I will go on. That's kind of our attitude towards retirement. We're just going to keep pushing it out further and further and further. Look at this chart, UK labour force participation by age. From the age of 48 onwards, it starts to drop. The idea that by raising the state pension age from 66 to 71, you're going to get a big boost in the labour force participation rate is a nonsense. Because if you're not working before the retirement age, you won't be working if you then extend it. Why do people drop out of the labour market from 48 to 49 onwards? Some of it, a lucky few, are wealthy enough to say, I don't want to work. But it's a minority. Most of this is people who are ill, they've got to care for someone who's ill, their skills are out of date, or they fall victim to ageist policies amongst firms. So tackling that, as I say, is the nearest thing I can see to a free lunch. And it's a hard one to do, but if you could half that rate of decline between 48 and 65, in the UK, that's a 6% boost in the labour force. So lots of changes to happen here in terms of careers. The 100-Year Life book did a lot about that. Be really wary of that post-50s dip. Is your job age-friendly? Will it help you carry on working for longer? Will you have the skills and motivation to do it? Retirement is changing completely. The 20th century retirement meant that we took a lot of time after we finished work. As longevity increased, and the retirement age stayed the same. I think what we're going to see in the 21st century is taking more leisure this side of retirement, as retirement becomes more of a gradual process, moving to part-time before you stop work, career breaks, and perhaps sometimes working intensely and sometimes less intensely. Real problems, by the way, around how we have hierarchies and how we get intergenerational connectivity, which is perhaps something we can talk about. I'm in a business school. I talked a little bit about jobs. I've got to talk about products. One of the things I find about the aging society, this sort of miserable story that quickly sort of feeds through to discussions that in Japan they sell more adult diapers than baby diapers because there's now more old people than young people, is an attempt by lots of consulting firms to put a positive spin on it. So there's a thing called the silver economy, which is basically going to firms and saying, hey, there's lots of products you can sell to old people. And it basically takes two forms. The first is to say, hey, guess what? You can sell more adult diapers than baby diapers, so it kind of turns a negative into a positive. The other is to say, look, older people like cruises, they like Rolling Stones reunion tours, they want to have fun, and these people have got lots of money and they're very, very wealthy. I want to talk about not the silver economy, but the evergreen economy. Because in a world where you will become old and you worry about outliving your health, your wealth, your finances, your skills, your purpose, your sense of engagement, you want to spend money to remain evergreen. Yes, I will spend money if I'm misfortunate enough to get dementia and need someone to care for me. I will spend a fortune to avoid getting dementia. And so this, to me, I think, is the products and services. Business is the distribution arm of social change. Yes, we need individual change. Yes, we need government policy. But the products and services needed for support us to have a longer life and a healthier life, that's what I call the evergreen economy. Just want to finish a little bit with some sort of wider thoughts, because Simone de Beauvoir in the 1970s wrote this brilliant book called Old Age, and she's angry. She's really angry. She's angry about marginalization. She's angry about prejudice. And I think this is a great quote. People are often advised to prepare for old age, and if that merely applies to setting aside money, choosing the place for retirement and laying on hobbies, will not much be better for it. What's the point of living a long life? I often get people say, well, why do I want to live a long life? And I say, well, I don't know. It's up to you to work out yourself. But we've got to have a purpose. And one of the interesting things I think about longevity is because we underestimate the capacity of older people in later life, we're not quite sure what they do. And that's what de Beauvoir was angry about. She was talking about a society which started to dislike death, had introduced retirement so older people were unproductive, and said there's no role for older people anymore. What is their point? So we invented sort of, retirement homes for them, said, look, you can all go there. But if we're all expecting to live into our 90s or even beyond, what is the point? Now, of course, the point of a long life is yours to discover. It's not mine. I mean, each person's going to do different things. I'm very against the concepts of successful aging. We don't say people have a successful adolescence or a successful middle age. I mean, we just got to kind of work it out as we go along. But in working on longevity, I came across a psychologist who kept saying, it's about adult development. And you know what? It took me ages to work out what they meant. And that's it. If you're healthier for longer, if you're more productive for longer, if society gives you options, you can develop as an adult. My father was never a teenager. Teenagers were invented in 1937. He went from being a child to being an adult. Adult development was done very quickly. My children are developing at a slower pace than I did in terms of taking on that full remit of adult responsibilities. But actually, if you're living longer and you've got more years ahead of you, you'll be developing and changing as a person. David Bowie once said that the point of aging is a miraculous process whereby you become the person you're always meant to be. And of course, typical Bowie, it's both brilliant and copied from someone else. It's from Pindar. And Pindar just said the point of life is to become who you are, having discovered what that is. And we so don't think of old age as a time when people can change, evolve, and develop. We sort of think it one as just in terms of decline. So this, I think, is the fundamental value of a later life. And with that comes all sorts of cultural shifts, really big cultural shifts. I've kept emphasizing we have to stop underestimating the capacity of older people and our own later years, because if you do, you will underinvest in them, and guess what? You won't have much capacity when you reach them. We have to work out new narratives. We have to move away from the ageism that is so redolent. The 20th century basically medicalized old age and made it very heavily about decline. And not everything declines with old age. Okay? But the other thing that I think is really key is that we're wedded to this concept of chronological age, which is pretty modern in history. It was only with record-keeping, numeracy, and literacy that we started looking at our year of birth. But really, longevity says there's two other concepts of age which are really important. Prospective age, how many more years you've got to come, and your biological age, how are you aging? And both of those suggest that we should be behaving differently. As I said, at 58, I need to behave differently from my father because I've got more years ahead of me. That's that prospective age. In the UK, we talk about an aging society. The average Brit has never been so old, never had so many years left to live. That's a complicated situation to be in. And then, of course, biological age we know is malleable, and maybe even more malleable than we imagine if you look at some of the science that is coming along. And because of that, we can change how we age. So much of our stereotypes about aging come about because life was short and education was limited. But if we're living longer, we have to experiment more. Take things like simple financial rules that say, hey, switch into safe assets when you hit 60. Well, you've got 40 years ahead of you. Why would you do that? And that's not just about assets. It's about all sorts of things in life about taking risks. But I think this is the key one, I think, at the end here, which I think is the really big problem. And I had a quote by Proust, but I cut that out. We see aging as an event. We see being old as a state. And the older I get, the more I realize that's wrong. No one tends to self-identify as old in my experience. And that problem with the aging society is we think it's about being old and end of life. Aging is a process. It begins in utero. It's a process that is malleable and you can change. And somehow the notion that aging is an event that is triggered and you become old and you used to be young is deeply wedded in the aging society story. It's why those Chinese MBA students sort of said, oh, aging societies, that's nothing about me. Aging is a process. What you do now is linked to your future. And with more future ahead, we've got to focus on that process and think about it as a recursive and as an optimizing, and think, what do I hand over into the future? And let me now truly nearly come to now. I just want to finish one kind of weird thought. And I kind of like, there's a, I think there's something very mundane about this topic, which is literally, do you eat fresh vegetables? Do you have breakfast? How do you exercise? But it's also something quite fundamental when I begin by saying, hey, we've got to change how we age. Because that's a radical departure for humans. And there's something about tackling aging which is quite unique to aging and not with other diseases. When you get better at tackling infant diseases, you're less interested in infant diseases. You now interested in midlife diseases. When you get better at tackling midlife diseases, you're now interested in the diseases of aging. What's interesting about aging is the better we get at aging, the more we're going to push aging into the future, and we remain continually interested in aging. So it's really quite fundamental. When we're ill in our 80s and 90s, no one wants to live to 100. But if we find a way to be well and prosperous in the 80s and 90s, bring on 100. And then, of course, if we're ill in 110s, we don't reach 120, but if we're well in 110s, then bring on 120. So I'm not here to tell you you're all going to be living to 200 or 300 or anything of that form, but there is something really quite dramatic at this moment in human history, because if we get better at aging, we're going to want to age more. And so we've got this sort of competition going between human ingenuity and human biology. I have no idea who's going to win out. I know for sure that we can age better. The huge inequalities in society tell us that we've got people who are in their 50s and 60s who don't need to be. And we know that there are people who are well in the 90s and people who aren't, and we think there's something we can do about that. But this virtuous circle says we may be entering a really quite dramatic time. But then, remember I said this was an aggregate thing that's about you as an individual? So this is my point about bringing it back to you as an individual. There's the whole crowd, and then there's you. 80%, 20%. Up until about the age of 85, the best estimates are that 20% of how you age is genetic, 80% is about your behavior and your environment. Wow. Just think about that. I've just said that you're hopefully likely to get old, we fear getting old, and 80% of how you age up until around 80 is due to your behavior and your environment. So what are you going to do to be evergreen? I can think of a few things more important for your future than being evergreen. So thank you very much.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Andrew. That was fascinating. Took so many notes, I don't even know where to begin, but we're probably going to chat for about 20 minutes, I guess, and then we're going to open it up to questions, both in the audience and also people who are looking on to Zoom, so there'll definitely be an opportunity for you to get your questions in and start with it. But there was a couple of things that I wanted to pick up on, and let me just pick up on this very last point that you made, in fact, that, you know, for most of our lives, our behavior and our environment is really what determines aging, and in a way that's something we've known for a long time. I mean, as you mentioned, I wrote a book about middle age over 10 years ago, and you know, people would ask, well, what's the new miracle cure, the new miracle drug for living longer? And I was like, we know it already. It's exercise and diet, but nobody does it.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, you're talking about kind of reorienting the way that we look at our society and our own lives, taking more responsibility both for our financial health. And yet what we've seen at every age, in fact, people are worse and worse at that. You know, we know about smoking, and now we've gone to vaping instead, you know, which is only slightly. Or, you know, we have obesity. You mentioned, we were talking before about Ozempic. You know, all of these habits that we have in our control, we have widespread knowledge about. So, you know, how capable are we ourselves of change?
I'm good in some things and I'm terrible at others, and I think everyone's the same. They're probably in different ways. So I guess I'll answer the question in the following way. So the first is, I think we have seen changes in behavior for sure. And so if you look at people's health, if you look at people's mobility, on average, and averages are very cruel in this world, we are aging better, so people are doing things differently. We drink a lot, and I'm talking about averages here, we drink a lot less, we smoke a lot less. There have been really successful public health campaigns that have changed behavior. So we can change behavior. I think the other thing that has shifted too is our incentive to do it has shifted. And I think, you know, we've known these things all along, but it's never been so important to do it. And I think as people become aware of the change, they will do more of it. But I'm not saying this is easy. I think the change happens slowly. And right now, if you think about the way our food system works, you think about all the sort of the way our air works, it's not easy. However, if you look at inequality in society, you can see that one bunch of people are doing it very well because those with resources and living in a good environment are aging better. So I think, you know, one group have done it, so how do we then tackle the inequalities around? I think also, as I say, this is going to be a joint individual responsibility. I think we will see medical change that happens that makes it easier to do things. You know, I don't want to talk too much about COVID, but during COVID, we made it easy for people to self-test, to wear masks. So there are lots of things we can do to make it easier that will bring about change. I think we'll also see some interventions. We'll see social norms. It's not going to change quickly. I mean, your book on middle age, which is fascinating, because everyone always looks at sort of teenagers and then old age, but then you say, well, actually, we need to change middle age. It doesn't happen overnight. Social norms, social practices, and we change. So I think it is possible, but it doesn't happen on a dime.
Let's talk a little bit more about an issue you just mentioned in this inequality. And what I see happening, which we've already seen it, and I can see even more so happening around this kind of, particularly when we talk about health and longevity, is that, you know, people at the very top with access to good and better health care. And in every way in our healthcare system, or at least let's talk about the US and the UK, that inequality gap has been increasing, as we've seen over the decades, and health outcomes are diverging more and more. And I think the fear is that I have when you talk about, you know, putting more resources into the evergreen and versus health, that you're going to actually have that focus on a very small percentage of society at perhaps the latest years of their lives at the expense, let's say, in terms of resource allocation earlier on.
And why do you think that?
Well, I think that's the trend that we've been seeing actually in healthcare.
So I think what you've got at the moment is, if you've got an intervention system, you're going to fail to keep people healthy for longer. So if you look at the great advances in health and mortality, they've all had a massive public health component and making sure people get access. So completely, I mean, the point at the end of the book, what I say is, I think you've got to be really wary of billionaires putting money into stem cell research, because that's great for a billionaire. It's going to be incredibly expensive. If it works, it's going to offer radical life extension. That's the last thing we want. So we've really got to focus on the causes of aging early on. And there's actually plenty of things I think we can do that are pretty cheap. You know, I talked about things like cardiovascular disease, which is a form of aging. And there are pretty cheap treatments that can lower cholesterol, which could be made available. And I think, for me, the biggest challenge we've got at the moment is that we let responsibility to those who have got the resources and the environment to invest in their health, but we haven't got a health system that encourages about the many. So it's a radical redesign of the health system, but that focus on preventative health and making sure we give access, I think will both save the government money, and actually I don't think it's terribly expensive. So in the UK right now, there's Our Future Health, which is trying to scan 5 million people. And of course, if you have full preventative health, you know, you go to Harley Street, it's going to cost you a fortune. But if you find out pretty quickly which things people are genetically disposed to and you focus on those, I think you can do a system that is cheap and effective at creating health. There will always be health inequalities. I'm not saying we can achieve complete equality, but I think this is what we need to change the system, because if we don't change the system, we're going to have those growing health inequalities.
And will there be the resources to change the system? I mean, looking at the UK, and obviously I'm an outside observer here to some degree, but you know, again, when you were talking about this kind of access to healthcare, in a lot of ways, it seems much worse now than it was years ago.
It is, and it's interesting because at the moment I'm doing work with the UK government, both Treasury and the health system, trying to pull them together. They're all suddenly saying, oh wow, the economy is not growing, we've got 3 million people ill, we've got rising health costs. This current system is not sustainable. So the question then is, if we switch towards preventative health, does that actually save money and does it boost GDP? And I think there's an awareness that that could be the answer. The thing I'm trying to do is just show them it's the answer. But you know what you've got to do? You've got to show that actually preventative health works and intervention is not the right way to boost the economy or to keep people healthy. I think it's also this thing about we can change how we age. It's about not assuming that it is fixed and moving away from a disease system. So none of this is easy. This is a very, very fundamental change in how we think about our life. But the health system that has been so gloriously successful in getting the average life expectancy in the UK to 86 just cannot carry on in its current form. It's got to shift to preventative. And I would say that we can't afford not to. If you look at the Office of Budget Responsibility's projections of what's going to happen as we have this aging society and failing health, it's just ever more debt. So I don't think we've got any alternative. And as I say, I think it's pretty cheap to do. We saw with COVID, you can do some really cheap stuff in the community that's preventative, that keeps people healthy. It's just not the way we've done it because we're so used to diseases early in life.
So let me jump around on this idea of disease, because this was a point that you talk about in the book, in which I think is kind of a fascinating discussion, whether aging is a natural process or is it in fact a disease?
Yeah.
And of course, like everything, a lot of the terminology are kind of stories that we tell to make sense of very confusing experience in life. And there was a whole period where we talked about addiction. Was that, how much of that was self under individual control, or was it a disease? And I'm curious, you seem to be kind of moving towards the disease model in terms of thinking about aging, but I'm curious because you obviously you've looked at a lot of this research. Where you come out on that?
So I don't know about, there's this a huge debate because, of course, if you declare aging as a disease, you're saying that all old people are diseased. And there's a sort of negative stigma that's pretty big. I think there's a couple of issues. We tend to distinguish health from aging. And I think that's a really interesting distinction. We sort of assume that aging is natural. And, a lot of the evolutionary biologists say that aging is a quirk, it's a bug, not a feature of our system. And there's a quote in the book by Montesquieu that in the 17th century that says, aging is the most unnatural thing because you've got to survive all the diseases that get you when you're young to experience aging. And I think that's kind of interesting because we used to think smallpox was natural. We used to think cholera was natural. And now we think, aging, we can't do anything about aging. And the pessimism of the aging society is that there is nothing we can do about aging. And there is things that we can do. We talked about sleep, diet, alcohol, all those obvious health hygienes. And then I think there will be drugs coming along that will help us. And those drugs will tap into the understanding of the biology of aging such that you might get drugs to help us with arthritis, for instance. We've got drugs coming along with dementia. So I think you will start to see drugs that help us with these aging-related diseases. I'm nervous of calling aging a disease. One, because I'm not a scientist, so I've got to be very careful what I say in all of this. But also, there are clearly diseases that are aging-related. I'm not sure that biological aging has only one form. I think there are multiple channels in the body. I think here, this is where just our vocabulary lets us down. So I wouldn't want to call aging a disease, but I do think there are lots of aging-related diseases. And as we focus on the biological process of aging itself, we will postpone the arrival of cardiovascular disease, dementia, etc. And that's where the obesity drugs are really interesting, because in some ways they act as an anti-aging drug. They push down the risk of getting multiple diseases until later. So conceptually, that's a bit like having a drug that helps you age better.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it sounds like that looking at the field, there's a lot of kind of interesting drugs and possibilities of coming out. To what degree can we, meaning perhaps the government, kind of push resources to focus that kind of research and those research dollars on things that can be more widely enjoyed, as opposed to, more Botox so you look better?
Well, I think we're going to get, increasingly we're going to healthcare, because when you shift to preventative health, I think you will inevitably see something of a two-tier health system, where there's a sort of, hopefully a high-level basic, and then there'll be people who say, I want to pay more on top of that. But there's a guy, I mentioned near Basel earlier on, he's trying to look for the sort of the geroscience version of a statin, something that just sort of helps us more. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. I think, what's interesting with all of these, going back to aging as a disease, one of the great ironies of life is that the World Health Organization is in charge of the international classification of diseases. Health is health. Health is the absence of disease. And how we actually focus on maintaining health is important. And so if we go back to looking at diseases, I think that's a challenge. What we're going to focus on is how do we maintain the health?
Well, I thought it was interesting in the book, in fact, you make the comparison to psychology and the positive psychology movement, which for so long of its time, psychologists looked on defining mental illness as opposed to focusing on how to encourage mental health.
Exactly.
And it sounds like that's kind of what you're arguing.
I think so, that's right. We need to know much more about the determinants of health. And going back to the aging stuff, I also give a metaphor, which is my desperate attempt as an economist to understand the biology of aging, which is like trying to control the economy. The body is an incredibly complicated system. I don't think we're ever going to have one pill that says, hey, you're going to age well. But there will be main pathways and main interventions that can do something to help.
So, obviously, staying healthy longer is, as I guess close as you could get to a kind of core directive, which everybody to one degree or another is obsessed with, and understandably so. But looking at it historically, though, I think about the 1970s, which another kind of became attached to the name the me decade. And this idea of kind of health and wellness, but becoming so kind of self-inward looking that you have a society that becomes very obsessed with individual health and those with the resources to do it, as opposed to community. And I guess, obviously, you're talking about a society-wide change, but as we have seen kind of the health and wellness movement play out in the last, 50, 60 years, that's not the way that it has played out so much. It's much more individualistic and much less community-oriented, I think.
Yes, whether that's to do with health or just general trends. No, I think that's interesting. In the book I mentioned there's an interesting shift in how people see old age. So if you go American literature and magazines 200 years ago, whenever an older character was introduced, it was seen as about wisdom or family or civil society or justice. Now, whenever an older character is introduced in a novel, it's often about dementia and care homes. So we've seen this shift from things increasing from decreasing. And I think you've got to be careful with we want people to age better. I don't think that means about staying younger for longer. I'm always very nervous of those expressions, 60 is the new 50. I think 60 is just the new 60. And I think this is this thing about untangling age. Age is not just about decline. If we medicalize it, it is. And that's why I say the real purpose of a longer life surely is about adult development. It's to make sure that you are doing what you want to do and happier in doing it. And Laura Carstensen at Stanford has got great work on this. And we know that midlife, you've written, I'm not pointing to you because
I'm obviously at my
but because you wrote a book about midlife. But we know about the midlife dip in terms of happiness, and happiness actually is higher amongst 80-year-olds than it is amongst 40 and 50-year-olds.
Right.
So I think this is where we've got to try and, if we define old age purely in terms of health, and we see aging better as just about being healthier for longer, we're missing a huge part of it.
All right, I'm going to turn to questions soon, but I wanted to ask you one more question from myself first, which is this idea of rethinking retirement, which I think is kind of fascinating in the sense that retirement isn't something that happens kind of at the end of your career, all smushed together, perhaps at a point where some of the things you'd like to do, your body might not be up for. And it's interesting because I do think certainly the pandemic, for completely different reasons, has pushed us into that in terms of people working from home, people working 4-day weeks, taking off times. A lot of the kind of breaks that you're talking about do go along with a gig economy, which is flexibility is an upside, but a downside is also economic stability and security. And so I'm curious to hear more about how you're envisioning how a system like this might work and a way that we could institutionalize it in a, as you say, an economically productive way.
So there's a bunch of issues here. And of course, what this is all about is time and how we allocate time. You know, we created in the 20th century retirement, we created weekends, and as life has got longer, it's about what do we do with that time, and if it's healthy and productive, we can switch time around at different points. So I think this is a really, really big issue. I think the key thing about retirement is when we lived to sort of late 60s or 70, retirement was short and kind of cookie cutter. Everyone came to a hard stop at the same age. And the real thing that characterizes retirement now is diversity. People no longer tend to stop at the same age. Some stop early, some stop late, some go part-time, some carry on full-time, some unretire. Because people have got different interests, they've got different options, and they've got different preferences. So I think you're going to see just enormous variety around that. Why should the firms do that? Well, first of all, by the way, you know, retirement, as you know, is illegal in most countries. It's just the state timing of the state pension that we now call retirement. But in most professions, you cannot force someone to retire because of age. And I think that leads to some interesting issues. And let me sort of give you an economic take on retirement. So the economic take on retirement is you stop work when the marginal benefit of working is less than the marginal cost of working. So if work is arduous, if it's physical, if it's heavy hours, if you're in poor health, then you're going to see the marginal cost of work rising very, very sharply. If you find your work alienating, you don't get a sense of identity with it, the marginal on the wage is low, you're going to have a low marginal benefit. If you enjoy work, if it's not very physical, you may want to work for every day for the rest of your life. In economics, we like stationary outcomes. We like to sort of say that, you know, in the same circumstances, you'll make the same decisions. And so that's probably why some academics will work just their entire life, because they've got that world where they can do that. I think in lots of other professions, they haven't. So therefore, we need to look at jobs that are more age-friendly. And that sounds a vague term, but I've done some big work with Darren Acemoglu characterizing that and saying what are the jobs that are age-friendly in the sense you can carry on working for longer in them. And we've also got to work on people's health, but making work more flexible is going to be a key part of that. And that does seem to be a big trend, because it's not just older people that appreciate more flexible work, it's also younger people as well.
But isn't there those also somewhat, at least as they're always even putting aside the aging issue, of this kind of mismatch between the jobs that are available and, you know, the skills of the people who are wanting to work there? I mean, obviously that's a big issue in a lot of these countries, the UK in particular, in terms of the jobs that are available. A lot of people don't want those jobs because they don't see the marginal benefit as being big enough.
Yeah, so if that's about skills, I think we've got two really big issues in the labour market. One is that firms are ageist and assume older people haven't got relevant skills or can't retrain. The second thing is we don't have, of course, London Business School being a glorious exception, a good platform for adult education. I mean, this whole thing about adult development, you will have to keep updating your skills, keep updating your interests and your enthusiasms. And we've got to provide ways of doing that. Why should firms do it? I don't think all firms will. I think firms that care about human capital will. The other thing is, just go back to that statistic. 70% of UK employment growth the last 10 years is workers aged over 50. If you don't cater for this age group, you're going to be in problems.
All right, I know we're running later, but let me open up to questions here. And I think there's someone with a microphone. Is that? Oh, you've got it. Okay, great. Let's start with over here, second row. Okay, and then there's another question, that gentleman there, he'd be second.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Scott. That was fascinating. Wonderful to see such a kind of refreshing and optimistic take on the future. Now, we seem, at least according to my own feeds, my own social media feeds, to have been moved from the Malthusian crisis you were talking about earlier on, of too many people to support the planet, into something more, it's something really the opposite, where something like 2/3 of us are living in countries where we're not at replacement rate.
Yeah.
Now, some of the arguments made, particularly from the far right or Silicon Valley, are we need to be boosting those birth rates, and quite famously, countries have been utterly failing at doing that. Now, there's an election coming up this year, and you've kind of nodded a little bit at it earlier on, but Prime Minister Scott wins at a landslide. What policies do you bring in the first 100 days to bring on the evergreen economy?
Well, there's a lot of, obviously, devils in the detail, but I would do three things. Absolutely a switch towards more preventative health. I mean, there are things out there that we know that can keep us healthy for longer, that if we intervene early, they're not expensive and are cheaper than doing full-blown interventions later on. To do that, I also think we have to have hardwired into our health system a target that is aiming at healthy life expectancy. The most important thing with an aging population is healthy life expectancy. GDP is incredibly important. You get healthy life expectancy right, welfare will be okay, and GDP will get sorted. Secondly, I would focus on boosting the employment rate for people aged 50 to 65. I wouldn't focus on raising the state pension age. I think preventative health will be a very big part of that. I think about arrangements to help with caring is going to be absolutely key. Caring is a huge burden for people working later. I would tighten age discrimination legislation, and I would also start to think about how we get true, proper adult education and lifelong learning going. So they would be some of the key things that I would focus on. But by the way, I mean, the essence of this book is there's things we can do tomorrow, but this second longevity revolution, it doesn't happen tomorrow. This is a really big social change. When for the first time ever in human history, the young and middle-aged can expect to become old, society doesn't turn on a dime. There's pretty deep-seated cultural problems we've got to try and tackle in all of this. The other thing I would try and do, and it's interesting you sort of talked about the declining population, which is a real challenge. I do think we're seeing a slight shift in narrative from there's being too many old people to now saying, wow, where's the hell all the young people gone to, and why aren't people having kids? I think what's really interesting in all of that is there's a sort of a notion that we should change our behaviour to save institutions like Social Security. Oh my goodness, pension system's going bust, we've got to have people having more kids. I think we've got to work out why people aren't having more kids. And if it's a choice variable, rather than try and offer them bribes and things of that form to have more kids to save Social Security, we've got to say, how do we adjust the life course so that actually we achieve what we want to do? And I would say that comes back to the Longevity Society aim as well, because for all the people kick back about the positivity of what I'm talking about, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying this is the most important thing we face as a society. And if we do not invest in these things, we're going to get the very aging society stories we fear. And when for the first time ever the young and middle-aged can expect to become old, we've got to change what we do to ensure that we age better. And I think that's the really key thing. How do we then make the most of these longer lives rather than change our behaviours to fit in with whatever the social institutions are?
Question there, and then we'll move to a Zoom question.
I haven't got the microphone, but I guess you can hear me. What do you feel about the Blue Zones work that's been widely disseminated? Is it a science or is it a cult? Do you think it has value for the sort of work you've been talking about?
So I know Dan Buettner. I think he's good, and I think he's great. I think getting people to think about what to do and how to live healthy, sustained lives is great. We do like the idea that there's a pill that's going to keep us immortal. We do like the idea there are these Shangri-Las somewhere where life is perfect. I think most of the advice that comes out from that is just really sensible. It's the sort of sensible stuff that Patty was talking about. Don't drink too much, be part of a community, be engaged, be purposeful. I can't criticise that.
Exercise.
Yeah. There is an academic paper which is very interesting that says that there's something else the Blue Zones all have in common, which is bad record keeping. And so actually the disproportionate number of centenarians is not really true. I forget the precise numbers now, but Japan tightened up on its social security and wanted proof that some of the people they were paying pensions to actually existed.
Yeah.
And the number of Japanese centenarians dropped quite dramatically at that point.
Things that blue zones don't have, though. They don't have mobility, and they don't have retirement.
Yes, and retirement, I mean, if you think about the word retirement, it is an evil word, isn't it? Because the notion of retiring from the world, I think, is not something anyone wants to do. You might want to rest, you might want to have some quiet time, but what we know that the thing that really keeps people having a good life for long, one is positivity, but the other is a sense of engagement and purpose. And that's different for everyone. As a university professor, you may find that studying. Other people may want to be on the golf course, but having some sense of purpose. And I think in that sense, retirement is an unfortunate phrase.
Let's go to a Zoom question. Oh, go ahead.
Can't say no to Lucrezia, can
Go ahead.
I wanted to insist on the issue of fertility, which you mentioned just at the very end. I mean, one thing that old women cannot do is to have children. But fertility may be endogenous, so in a population we know now that fertility decreases and longevity increases, but as society changes in its age composition, what do you think is going to happen to fertility? Because, the dynamic of population could be quite tricky.
Yeah, I spent a long time looking at longevity, and I'm now very interested in fertility, so who knows what but let me give you some thoughts on that one. So the first is, actually, from an age structure problem, it's a real challenge, because when people get older and need caring, if they haven't got children, which is going to be increasingly the case, that's a big problem. So this is why the intergenerational stuff becomes incredibly important. And, I was born in London. When I used to go to family parties, there seemed to be hundreds of cousins, dozens of aunts and uncles, and a couple of grandparents. So now the age distribution in the UK and US is more like a tower. In many Asian countries, it's more like a cruise ship. And so, we've got to really change the intergenerational stuff in quite a profound way. But no, I think that there's a real challenge. So the question is, do people want fewer children? And some people are saying it's good for the environment, and I think there's something in that. Some are saying it's about quality of life and the quality of bringing up children. But if the extent to which it's adult development taking longer, and you then squeeze the time in which you can have children, one of the options I think a longer life brings is, can we be more flexible in how we manage our time to make it easier for people to have children if they want them? And we know time and time again that, by and large, tax incentives don't work to really boost the fertility rate. And it's really a question of flexible working and giving people the support. Now, whether we can have multiple generations, and that's a way of actually helping look after children, but I've got no simple stories. I don't think the fertility rate is going to rebound dramatically. I think you will see a little bit of a pickup in the fertility rate. Two things are happening. People are having fewer children, and they're having them later. And for a while, that means the fertility rate's falling even more dramatically than it looks like it's falling than it should be. So I think you'll see a little bit of a pickup. But clearly, we're not going to hit the replacement rate of 2.1, which is an existential crisis.
The Zoom.
Okay, great. Let me just ask a few questions on behalf of the virtual participants. So the first is from Shivani Kumaria, who asks, considering India's life expectancy at birth is around 70 years, can we still talk about second longevity revolution in developing countries?
Yeah, totally. So first of all, 70, it's quite interesting if people don't think 70 is old, because most of human history that is. Aging-related diseases kick in at 50. And the other thing about that 70 is, I don't want to get sort of too into life expectancy stats, but the way that most life expectancy statistics are quoted are based on mortality rates today. So they're assuming that a child lives their entire life in today's mortality rates. But of course, a newborn today in 40 years' time will face different mortality rates than today. They tend to improve. So actually, life expectancy in India, the cohort measure is probably above 70. The challenge you've got, I think, with the ageing society story is we always focus on the current old. And India doesn't have many current old. It's got lots of young. But the trouble is, if you don't think about the life course, then those current young will be a very large proportion of older people. And if you don't ensure that the current young become the healthiest ever future old, India will have a problem.
Do you have why don't we do one more, and then we'll go back to the audience.
Okay, so another question from the virtual participants. So Caroline Chill asks, where do you believe the leadership for social and political change towards a longevity society should come from?
Well, I do think, well, where's it going to come from? So, you know, I don't want to give a sort of an easy answer because there's no one person who's responsible for it. I do think we've got a lot of cultural baggage to jettison. This idea that aging is inevitable, that we underestimate the capacity of old people, is pretty deep-seated. The notion that the young don't become the old is pretty deep-seated. Some of that is, I think, to do with demographics in the sense that for most of history, the young haven't become the old. Secondly, if you're old, you can remember being young, but if you're young, you just can't imagine yourself being old. So, you know, there's that sort of short-termism. So it's a very deep-seated cultural change. But you know, well, like all cultural changes, you can look around and you'll see people behaving differently. You have debates about Biden versus Trump in the US election and say, does it matter that these people are old? You're going to start asking questions like, well, why are European leaders getting younger and American leaders getting older? Is that a good or a bad thing? What's the difference in the institutions? And you just see people behave differently. And I think that's the main way in which you'll see social change. I do think we've urgently got governments to start to focus on preventative health. The notion that there are things governments can do now that will help us age better if we change the health system, and we're not doing them, I think is a real problem. So I do think governments need to change. I think they will.
All right. There's so many questions, but we're getting close to 7 o'clock. So this young woman up here in the white, is there a microphone?
The hardest spot to get to.
Yes, of course. That's why I picked it.
So my question is a little bit gloomy because you talk about changes. So for example, in preventable medicine and how AI can help it. But there are other mega trends that I think can hinder these. So for example, AI, but replacing jobs, which wouldn't allow to create more job opportunities for old people, and also climate change. So that may actually reduce our life expectancy if you talk about mortality. So what's your take on that, and how can it be integrated in this adult development challenge?
Yeah, no, it's always a problem. You know, when people talk about AI, they never say, oh yeah, but you're ignoring longevity. But when I bring up longevity, everyone says, oh, you're ignoring AI and climate change. They're all really important. And, you know, as I say, I think your future is going to be really influenced by how we do AI. It's also going to be really influenced by how you age and how society supports you aging. And I think they're all really important. How do they interact? I think they interact in pretty substantial ways. You know, we had Darren Asamoah here at a Wheeler Institute event, and Darren's point is, you know, technology doesn't automatically lead to social progress. It's what we want. You know, we have to demand the social progress that we want, and the AI that helps us. And you know, I would say it's the same with longevity. If you want to age healthily, we need to put political pressure on people to achieve it. We've got to make sure we don't have the billionaires giving us radical life extension, but instead we get cholesterol-reducing injections. You know, there's 101 things. I am nervous about AI. I don't think we can simply say it's going to be good. I think, actually, when it comes to older workers, AI and robotics are actually pretty good. Japan and South Korea massively invest in robotics in manufacturing because they've got a very elderly workforce, and actually it's helping people stay at work for longer. So I think there's one little advantage there. Climate change and longevity. One of the biggest influences is how we age is air quality, for instance. And so I think there's absolutely no conflict there between the two. I think the two actually go hand in hand. I also think the longer you live, the longer you need to worry about the future, and the more you need to worry about long-term risks as well. So, yeah, and I set out what I'm trying to do is get longevity up there as something we have to adapt and adjust to. It's, I think, as important as AI and climate change. It doesn't trump them. I just think at the moment it's sadly lost amongst it all, and I worry that that's a problem.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. I lied. There is one more. Okay, so here, over there.
Thank you very much, Professor Scott, for the presentation, and very much looking forward to reading your book. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the second kind of revolution that we're going through right now, because I completely agree. The first one seemed to be a bit more scientifically robust and straightforward in a way. We had Ian Fleming invent antibiotics down the road, and kind of all of us, to an extent, owe him that we're here today. We had things like cardiovascular disease, statins, whatever. Those are relatively easy to dispense and quite easy to take, and they have had a profound effect. The problem now is that we live, as you said, no problem. The challenge is that we live significantly longer. That gives us more time with ourselves, which means that we have more opportunities to interact with our health and to even mess up our health in many ways. And that's harder for people to counteract with medication, whatever that type is. As a result, the things that we're talking about, exercise, diet, all the things that we know about are the most vital ones. However, just to ask a more of an economics question, it seems to be that there is definitely some resistance or some other interests that promote unhealthy living in many, many ways. Your social media app promotes depression, etc. There's a lot of interest in, for example, tax sugars, etc. They haven't worked. How do we think that the economic interests of being evergreen will compare to those that prevent us from being healthy? And what is the comparison there?
No, it's a really good question. I mean, of course, we've seen the problems of trying to impose a sugar tax, for instance. We know that's a politically difficult thing to do. So I think with all of these things, that longevity has so many different aspects and so many different features. So there's definite problems you're pointing to there. And as we see people smoke less, we see people vape more. So people will always be looking for things to make money from. But I'd also say if you look at the money being spent around health and staying healthy, that is rising very, very dramatically. Whether it's well-founded or not, you go to your supermarket and look at the things that are being sold today compared to 5 or 10 years ago. Yeah, there's lots of bad food, but I was a kid in the 70s. I can tell you, food was a lot worse then. So I don't want to paint. This is not a Panglossian story I'm telling you. It's not that suddenly we're going to catapult and all be healthy and living to 120. It's going to take a very, very long time. But that's what progress does, and that's what the past 200 years has got us to this point. The first longevity revolution has taken the whole history of humanity to get here. The second longevity revolution doesn't finish in 10 years' time.
Mm-hmm. All right, Andrew, thank you so much. There will be an opportunity. I think you're going to be signing books outside.
Glad you mentioned that, yes. Yep,
afterwards, a chance to buy them and to have them signed. It's very interesting, and I think we have a final word here. So
thank you. Thank you so much. Big round of applause. And to conclude, I just want first to say what a pleasure, honor, privilege it is that at LBS we attract such amazing faculty and we give them a platform that allows them to do such fundamental work. Work that I hope tonight changed your perspective on yourself and your society. But of course, we're not just about that work by our faculty. We're about taking this work into the world and using it to have impact. So, of course, that's about buying the book, gifting it, talking about it on social media. But I hope that you got from tonight that even though the book says the longevity imperative, what I heard is it's your longevity imperative. And the answer is actually in the slide, right? Because at first when I was listening to you, Andrew, I thought the most important word is evergreen. But then I noticed it in the slide. It's a great slide. Like the word that's italicized is you. And then the slide reminds us that actually we are not evergreens. It's a leaf. Maybe we are deciduous. But if we're going to have a good long life, the secret is, did you notice? The leaf is smiling. And that's my wish for all of you. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.